Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session on resilient supply chain. I'm Catalina Stefanescu-Cuntze. I am a professor of management science here at ESMT Berlin. Thank you. And it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this breakout interactive session on resilient supply chain. So my plan for this session is to start off in the first part with a short impulse, basically set the stage for the interactive discussion that will follow in the second part. And the trigger for our conversation is, of course, the fact that resilience of supply chains has been very much in the news, pretty much since the year when the world ran out of everything. So consumers have seen empty supermarket shelves in all kinds of products. This is the beginning of the pandemic. Things, of course, have not necessarily gone better since then. And unfortunately, it wasn't just consumer goods and office supplies that were missing, but also rather more critical factors such as shortage of ventilators that were used to treat critically ill COVID patients, a shortage of personal protective equipment such as face masks and hospital gowns, and even a shortage of blood donations, because due to the social distancing requirements, fewer people actually went out to give blood. So there was shortage everywhere. There was a failure of supply chains everywhere. And you may wonder, well, who's to blame for that? What was the trigger? The obvious answer is to blame the virus. But this is a little bit too easy, because that begs the question and that raises the expectation that, well, now that the world has opened up again, where are we? Is it all well now? And of course, the answer is not quite, because more recently, just a couple of months ago, shortages are back in the news again throughout Europe. Supermarket shelves are hit by panic buying. And in the manufacturing arena, we see again a shortage of computer chip supply that might be hitting auto manufacturers. So overall, this time there's a war going on, so yet another disruptive factor. COVID is still somewhere with us. So the question is, are we living in some sort of disaster-prone age? Are we particularly exposed to disruptions, and is this resilience something that is for today and that will hopefully disappear once we actually solve the problem? Now, the fact is that resilience and shortages are not new. They are not since the pandemic. In fact, they precede the pandemic. They have been around for quite a while. There is literally tens of thousands of examples of supply chain disruptions before 2020. And I wanted to give you just two of them because they're quite different in their respect. This is what happened a couple of years ago in UK, where KFC, the Kentucky Fried Kitchen chain, had to close down several of their outlets, in fact, most of them, due to a lack of chicken. And the reason for this was, the trigger for this shortage was a original transportation delay that was triggered by a road accident. So something as mundane, as simple as a road accident near a big warehouse can set into a chain of reactions that leads to a huge supply chain disruption. Around the same time, Adidas growth was hit by supply chain issues because they simply have experienced higher demand, much higher demand than they anticipated. So that's good news, right? That's not a problem. That's actually great news, higher demand. But the problem is that they were not able to keep up with that. So again, challenges with the supply chain, reactivity and capability to react to the underlying change in environment. The result of that is that resilience in supply chain has gained increased focus and attention, both by practitioners, governments and public bodies, and by academics. In the last pretty much 10 or 15 years or so, there are now more frequent audits of supply chain risks. There's more coverage in the press that points out, well, what can go wrong and what are the impacts when something goes wrong. And there is increased academic focus as well. I've done a survey with Web of Science, which is our repository of academic published papers. And I found about 4 papers in 2007 that were published with the keyword supply chain resilience. There were more than 400 in 2021. So a 100-fold increase over a relatively short time span, testimony to the increasing focus on the disruptions. But as the focus has increased, so has the trend in the disruptions taken off. The number of disruptions is indeed increasing, and the reason for this is because we have a higher frequency and intensity of a range of natural disasters, but also a multitude of geopolitical, cyber, and financial threats that are all coming together for the perfect storm of conditions. So before we actually get to talk about what are some of the strategies that companies and society can put in place for dealing with these very different threats, in fact, we should stop a moment and try to understand what triggers a supply chain vulnerability to these threats. Why do they fail? Why can't they cope with the challenges under these changing conditions? And it turns out that there's three broad classes of vulnerability, three main triggers that make modern supply chains particularly exposed to changing conditions. And those three classes of triggers that companies and society at large will need to address in order to mitigate these vulnerabilities. The first class is what we would call the globalization of supply chains. This goes without saying. In the last several decades, supply chains have become increasingly global, but also increasingly fragmented. There's now more suppliers for any given product. The fragmentation actually increases with the complexity of the product, as you would expect. This is mostly driven by a trend towards specialization of suppliers, getting higher quality, highly specialized components that can be sourced and produced in large quantity by designated suppliers. And just as an example, to visually see what the root of the problem is, this is the supply chain of Boeing. We all are familiar with this product, with this plane, but you see how the very different parts, and of course this is a simplification of the Boeing plane, how the very different parts of the airplane are actually literally spanning the globe in their production. Almost all of the continents are being involved in the Boeing supply chain, which makes it, of course, an incredibly difficult and challenging supply chain to manage. Together with a fragmentation of the supply chain, we are also seeing a geographical dispersion increasing. Partly this is driven by the desire for cost savings, for efficiency. It's driven by strategies such as outshoring and outsourcing, but it's also driven by the fact that some labor-intensive tasks are actually perhaps better done in different geographies. So overall, we're seeing more fragmentation, more geographical dispersion, which in turn results in longer trade routes. These components, when they are produced, they have to be shipped back to the assembly, the general plant. And these longer trade routes are then exposed to idiosyncratic shocks to a larger extent than if they were in a smaller geography and more concentrated area. What is an idiosyncratic shock? Well, this is an idiosyncratic shock. Just in the middle of the pandemic, the Suez Canal fiasco, the evergreen huge container vessel, one of the largest that sails the sea, has gotten stuck into the channel. And you can see that the Suez is actually the perfect representation of a bottleneck. It's long and narrow, with the result that the blockage led to about 200 ships waiting to pass the channel from one end to the other. And the total cost of disrupting about 12% of the global trade amounted to nearly $10 billion every day. The ship was stuck there for around a week. So huge impact for an event that was literally just provoked by according to the story, a gust of wind that was strong enough for the captain to lose track, to lose control, and to not be able to prevent the ship getting into the banks of the canal. So overall, geographical dispersion, increasing fragmentation leads to longer trade routes and higher exposure to idiosyncratic shocks. That's the first major category of vulnerabilities. What about the second root cause? Well, it comes from supplier concentration. Essentially, this means increasing reliance on a small number of dedicated suppliers for a few critical products. This again is being triggered by a general trend towards specialization, but also by potential economies of scale, and why not by the ease of managing a fewer number of supplier relationships, particularly in an age when there's increasing environmental and social stakes, and when you would expect to actually be able to know and to monitor what your suppliers in your chain are doing. And of course, it's easier to manage a smaller number of relationships than an extended number of relationships. The perfect example of that, and perhaps the most critical example of that, is the dominance of the semiconductor market by the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. The TSMC currently has around 70% by foundry volume, by revenue volume of the foundry market, and even higher than that, around 90–95% for the most advanced types of chips. So it's really almost total dominance, which was lately thrown in the spotlight with a recent shortage of semiconductor chips that the automobile industry has been suffering from. So this concentration results again in reduced risk diversification and even further exposure to idiosyncratic shocks. Imagine if something happened in Taiwan, what would we do about all of these chips? Second root cause, thus supply concentration. What about this third root cause? Well, this is the just-in-time lean manufacturing model that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, pioneered by Toyota back then, several decades ago. It has been since then enthusiastically embraced by modern manufacturing. It has also seeped into the service industry. It is, if you want, the dominant paradigm of modern industry, of the globalized industry. And there's many reasons for this. There's many reasons for its widespread appeal. Its focus on efficiency is driven, of course, by the fact that it decreases inventory cost and thereby it reduces the working capital requirement, the cost of capital. It also lowers the risk of spoilage and obsolescence of finished goods inventory, which is particularly critical in fast-moving industries. What do you do if you end up with a bunch of cars that nobody wants to buy because the next model came along? And of course, it increases product quality because it increases the chance that any defects in production are being caught up earlier on in the process, and you don't have a stock that you will have to scrap because it's been essentially defective. The adoption was so enthusiastic and so complete that several studies have put the rate of inventory decrease by US companies in the early decades of the adoption of just-in-time to as much as 6% per year. So 6% inventory shed every year for 20 years or more, leading to what we now call really lean processes, lean production facilities. What's the other side of the coin? Well, you can look at inventory as being a form of waste, and the focus of lean is to reduce waste, waste in space, waste in work in progress, waste in everything. But you can also see the inventory as being a buffer, a slack. And you know that when you don't have slack, when you have no slack in the system, then the exposure to uncertainty, to volatility, to ambiguity can be indeed very bad. So a lack of slack, a lack of buffer is perhaps one of the main driving forces that leads to the potential, the vulnerability of disruptions in supply chain. So overall, the three root causes for vulnerabilities are focusing the minds on the concept of efficiency, the efficiency-driven paradigm of modern industry versus the concept of resilience. There is a trade-off between the two. Should we go for one? Should we go for the other? And there is, if you want, on a conceptual level, a natural trade-off, because ultimately what efficiency means is optimal, almost perfect adaptation to the current environment. If you think about efficiency as getting the optimal output with a minimal input, the optimal ratio of input to output, that essentially means I know my environment and I'm going to optimally adapt to it. Resilience, on the other hand, it's about change. It's about the ability of the system
to withstand a change in the environment, a shift, very often a structural shift, very often a sudden shift and a severe shift. So of course, you know, it's like a little bit like natural selection. Once you optimize for one thing, you are less fit for the other thing. So in a certain sense, you can see this as being a trade-off. But it's also slightly more complicated than that, because the focus on efficiency was also, I believe, partly driven by a very human tendency to be able to manage what you can see and what matters and what is in front of your eyes. So we are facing with a challenge of measurement. Efficiency in economic terms can actually be measured, can be quantified through a series of economic and financial indicators. It is very well understood. There's a bunch of numbers that you can track, you can measure. So it's easy, it's at your fingertips. It's in your spreadsheet. It's very transparent to all of the players in the supply chain. Resilience, on the other hand, is much more ambiguous because it deals with the unknown. It deals with that which hasn't yet happened and which, moreover, you don't even know the shape of. So it requires imagination. It requires assessment of probabilities and risks. And there's many studies that show that the human mind is not particularly well suited to assess very low probabilities, to make essentially the difference between once in 1,000 and once in 1,000,000 kind of event. So that kind of thing, and also estimating the impact of a low probability event, makes measuring resilience and fitness from the resilience point of view very challenging indeed. And a second challenge that we're having is the fundamental trade-off of the difference in perspectives, the short term versus the medium to long term. Again, efficiency is and can be construed as being short-term driven. These are the numbers now. I'm going to focus that they look even better in the next period. I'm constantly going to improve, looking ahead and trying to do things better. Resilience is really about taking the really long-term view. I need to be prepared to act for something which may happen tomorrow, may happen in a year, may happen much later on. So this challenge of difference in perspective, this challenging difference in measurements have, I think, played a large part into this trade-off that many companies and the society at large has faced so far. So what are some ways to tilt the balance? If the focus has been so far so much on efficiency, what are some ways of actually tilting a little bit the balance? Well, we have three main classes of factors. So let's look at all of them in turn. In terms of the globalization, the fragmentation of supply chain, one option is to reshore, to bring production closer to home, thereby compressing the supply chains, shortening the geographical dependencies and the links, and therefore reducing both their risk and their environmental impact. Transportation on shorter distances has less of a carbon footprint. There's some evidence that this is starting to happen. The French government has announced 500 million of government support for about 500 companies that are reshoring production to France. It's also happening on a larger scale in the US. Just a couple of anecdotes. General Motors is reshoring battery production to Michigan. Intel is building semiconductor plants domestically. So overall, it's a trend that seems to be slowly picking up. What about the second cause, supplier diversification? Well, here, this is another trend that has started already to happen even before pandemic, because there was an increasing awareness that relying on mostly Asian suppliers, given the geopolitical and the geophysical risk in that region, is perhaps not very safe. So that trend will probably accelerate in the coming years. What I find interesting is that supply diversification may also reach forms that so far were not thought of as diversifying, such as vertical integration. And I would count here the recent EU's CHIPS Act, the European Union Act that is seeking to bolster the blocks production and development of semiconductors, offering about 43 billion in subsidies over the next 10 years. with the idea of reducing the continent's reliance on the Asian suppliers, and in particular on Taiwan. That's one strategy that seems to not be in play. And finally, the third factor, just in time. Well, if many companies have just in time, if inventory managed just in time is vulnerable to disruptions, then how about managing inventory just in case? And that is, again, some evidence that this is happening in several companies, including in the automotive industry in the US, that was thrown into disarray after the Canadian border protests and the trucker industry. But the interesting thing about managing inventory just in case, which basically means increasing safety stocks and building up pipeline inventory in critical points in the supply chain, is that this is a strategy at which companies have often arrived while having first tried the other two. So there's this McKinsey study that was done last year. 1 year into the pandemic, they have surveyed about 70 global supply chain leaders, and they asked them, well, back in May 2020, when COVID first struck, what did you set yourself up as objectives in terms of increasing the resilience of your supply chains? And now 1 year later, what have you actually done? What has been implemented? So the interesting story behind these numbers is that there was a higher percentage of firms that actually said, yeah, I'm going to nearshore production, 15%. I'm going to increase the supplier base, that's 40%. In the end, fewer companies than had planned to do so ended up actually increasing the supplier base or nearshoring production. What they did end up doing, and to a higher extent than previously planned, was to increase the inventory of the critical products and to increase the inventory along the supply chains. So what has actually happened has a higher intensity, a higher frequency than what was originally planned. And McKinsey called this, well, it's easier to build inventory than to build manufacturing capacities, and that's probably true, or to find new suppliers. But it is a fact that perhaps managing inventory just in case is the first port of call into trying to mitigate the risk of disruption to the supply chain. So overall, going back to the dilemma, efficiency versus resilience, is this really a zero-sum game? Does it have to be one or the other? So if you're thinking about the strategic choices of a company, what can they do? Well, and you can think that in the 2x2 world or matrix where you're talking about low resilience or high resilience, low efficiency or high efficiency, and this is where you find yourself now, along with what we call the economic frontier, the options, the strategic positions that are reflecting the current state of the art, the current process. Then you have essentially two options at first sight. You can either increase the inventory and construct a supply chain that is more resilient, but that will naturally also have higher costs because you have higher pipeline inventory overall. There are other actions that you can take as well, but the point here is that you increase resilience while decreasing efficiency. So you are increasing your costs. You can conversely increasing efficiency, so reduce, for instance, inventory, but this is going to increase your vulnerability to disruptions and to shocks. So your supply chain is going to become more fragile, more brittle, and then you move down on the economic frontier. Or, of course, you can say, yeah, frontiers are all very good, but in economics, at least, they're there in order to be pushed. So another option is to forget about moving along the frontier. Let's try to do a structural shift, a system improvement. Let's try to break out of this trade-off and to hopefully at the same time improve both resilience and efficiency. Now that sounds wonderful, but how do you actually do it in practice? Well, it turns out that the answer to that is not easy, but it is very much encapsulated in the two main levers that a firm currently has. And the first one is innovation. The role of innovation is really paramount in pushing the frontier of this choice of this strategic positioning between efficiency and resilience. What can we think of in manufacturing in terms of innovation? Well, there's many different directions in which the current industry is going. Manufacturing solutions such as additive manufacturing can reduce the need for a lot of pipeline inventory, because if you run out of stock, perhaps at some point you can replace the part that's missing. The need for low-cost labor could be diminished, could be reduced by a lot of the robotics technology that's now coming onto the market, and by increasing factory automation. And hopefully these two things together can also promote the reshoring of production operations to North America and to Europe. In terms of logistics hardware, a lot of the modularized forms of handling equipment in factories and warehouses can help and can reduce the need for transportation. New forms of transportation, such as autonomous trucks, that are reducing the need for labor in an industry that is now facing a critical shortage of truck drivers. These are other examples where innovation is really critical. One can also think about what we call flexible design, meaning designing a product from the beginning with the idea that some components are interchangeable, so that if you run out of one of them, you can still move on to the other. In construction, there's a big wave now using prefabricated materials in the US to build out houses without having to wait for the out-of-stock situation in the lumber industry. And one development that I particularly find very interesting is the growth of B2C e-commerce that was certainly spurred by pandemic, but that had started already before COVID, that leads to a huge restructuring of what we call city logistics, or last mile logistics, the last stretch before the package actually reaches the consumer. And we're talking here about both innovation in modes of transfer, such as use of drones and robots, about business model innovations such as click and collect, rather than wait for me to deliver the package to you, or crowd shipping. And we're talking about fulfillment option innovation as well. So all of that together, last mile logistics, huge improvements. And the second lever for pushing the frontier, which can also be seen as a form of innovation that by now is actually quite well established, is, of course, the role of digitalization. And here I would mention the data science solutions, so the algorithms, the models, the approaches that are actually can help in order to do a number of things in the supply chain. First of all, to increase visibility of the state of each node in the supply chain, of where are potential logjams and bottlenecks, such as, for instance, track and trace solutions. A trend that now is happening, is taking up more and more, is predicting demand uptake early by sensing the demand in the market using artificial intelligence and predictive analytics tools. This has been in place. Here's an example from Nike's that was, again, even before the virus hit. And it is a way of making your supply chain more reactive, because once again, it reduces the need for inventory if you can be more flexible in terms of anticipating your future demand. And again, in the under the umbrella of digitalization, I would mention the advanced information and communication technology. So this is really about data and the sharing of data. Sharing the data across the nodes and the partners in the supply chain. The idea here being that it's cheaper in a way to share data and information than to share hard inventory. It's cheaper to transform, to transport, to store, and of course to access than inventory. And this is a paradigm that's moving towards a different mode of working, a different mode of manufacturing. Rather than plan and execute, it's more a reactive approach. See, sense, try to predict what will happen, and then adapt in an agile way to what the market is telling you, while keeping the flexibility to still do nothing or do little, depending on what you're going to see later. Having said that, it behooves us to keep in mind that no matter what you do, and no matter how resilient you're making your supply chain, disruptions will always happen. They're just there. And we have this saying that there's nothing more certain than change. Well, just like change is always there, disruptions will always there. So with that in mind, resilience is really critical for survival, for individual, for company, and for society survival. Having said that, of course, efficiency continues to be paramount. So the critical decision here, the critical thing to strategic choice, if you want, is to find the right balance between efficiency and resilience, to find out what works for you. Where's the risk sharing mechanism and paradigm that all of the players in the supply chain can be happy about? And of course, to keep pushing that frontier, to keep investing in digitalization, in innovation, to put them at the best use, in search of a better world. So with that in mind, any questions?
Maybe you can also have online.
Yes. Thank you. Is he coming here? Okay.
I'll just read the first question for the benefit of the audience. First question is from Catalina. Should modeling the supply chain costs help to define where you want to stand in terms of resilience versus efficiency? What would be the rational way to go?
Modeling of supply chain costs, certainly. I mean, this is part of the big puzzle. It's a necessary step. Understanding your cost is always a good idea, but it's not so easy as it sounds. So the no, it's okay. So again, the challenge here is that some things are very easy to measure and some things are not. So when you're looking at the model, I always try to keep in mind the paradigm of COVID, and imagine that we are back in March 2020, and you're essentially in uncharted territory. You have seen a couple of infections, maybe 2, maybe 3, and you just know that this thing is going to take off. And you also know what shape this is going to take. You know that it will be exponential because that's what theory is telling you. What you don't know, however, is what exponential model exactly you will find yourself in. And so you can model your costs for sure, and you should do that. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to a choice, which has to be driven by other consideration than analytical consideration between the different models that are available. Yes.
Hello, my name is Florian Filter from Joschka Fischer and Company. And my question is, what is the role of sustainability and social justice in these supply chains? I mean, neither increases the efficiency nor the resilience, but it's also a huge impact on supply chains. What is this sustainability and social justice the third or fourth part besides resilience and efficiency, or are they somehow included?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an excellent question. I like to think that sustainability is part of the equation. So I will refer to sustainability and social justice as sustainability overall. But in my mind, there has been already some discussions, quite extensive, about the interplay between efficiency and sustainability. And there is some discussions about what the correlation is between the two, that in our quest for efficiency, we sometimes may be blinded to sustainability concerns. There has been much less attention devoted to the interplay between sustainability and resilience. My view is that to some extent, there is a correlation there because obviously if you increase the resilience and many of the strategies for increasing resilience do have an impact on reducing environmental footprint. So that clearly, hopefully should help. So I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I think they go hand.
This is, I'm Johan Jordan from Northwest University in South Africa. And this is a comment rather than an observation rather than a question. We had two major floods in our main harbor in Durban in South Africa. And those are the effects of global warming. The floods becoming more severe and they really disrupted the whole country supply chain because that's the main gate, my main import and export gate. It really, so the whole green agenda, etc., really had a big effect on our supply chain. So it certainly does come into the equation.
Yeah, for sure. But I think it's also broader than that, right? So it doesn't just involve the manufacturing industry, it also involves the consumer and the way that we consume products and the way that we want low prices. And ultimately, you know, the hidden elephant in the room is who's going to pay for this? In this tilting the balance, if you go from efficiency to resilience, who's going to cover the cost? And that's an open question, and that's a question that I think there should be more debate and more discussion about because it doesn't have an obvious answer. It's not clear. It probably depends on the industry, on the product, and on everything else. But it's not clear to what extent this is on the company, on the consumer, on the government. It's probably a bit of all. Right? Other thoughts? Comments?
I have a question.
Please go ahead.
Isabel is my name, and I work for more than 15 years in the semiconductor industry. And in this year, we learned a lot how to be efficient, to improve the processes, not to have any stock and so on. And this is the way what we learned at the university and so on. We implemented this. And now we see maybe the consequences that we couldn't see in the past. No? Are we planning to change the structure in the education in order to learn to be more resilient maybe, or to identify the problems that we will have in the future, because we are trying now to optimize all the situation. But now we have the problem with the energy. Reshoring, because energy is the next problem maybe. And the other thing also, we don't have employees, no? People, they also, we are discussing about the great resignation. No? There are a lot of discussions, and of course, then maybe data, the artificial intelligence will be a solution in the future. But what about the institutions, like this business school? No, how we will change also our mindset.
Well, so I can tell you a little bit of what is going on now in the business world, right, where this discussion has been around for a while. So as I said in the first part of this presentation, the challenge is not new. We've been aware of that. So it was clear, but you know, knowing that something is there and is important and actually putting it into practice is a different story. And of course, the main driver here was the question of cost. Who's going to pay for this? I think there is more and more increasing awareness that we need to have a discussion about this. And you know, there's no right or wrong way to proceed. So you can't really say this company should go for efficiency and this company should go for resilience. So it is really about finding the balance, which can be a matter of personal risk profile or company risk profile. It could also be a matter of regulation, which is a completely different topic altogether. So in that perspective, I think it's important to be aware that this challenge, this dilemma is there. There is an increasing trend towards giving it visibility and scope in business school curricula. I have actually introduced it quite a few years ago in my own operations management courses. So that is there. I think this trend will continue. but it is not something that you can teach, dogmatically. It's not something that you can say that's the strategy to pursue, because there is no right or wrong answer. It is a question of thinking, planning, discussing, and finding the right balance. And so what we can give is to stimulate this critical thinking, to give frameworks and to start the discussion. But ultimately, it has to be a discussion, and I do think it has to go beyond the business school setting, has to involve the society as a whole. Ultimately, also the consumers. Are the consumers willing to pay for resilience when the pandemic is no longer with us? Is that still important for them? As one thing, what we would answer to the survey, yeah, this is important for me. And there's another thing that we would be happy to pay for at the till or at the pump, as the case might be. But yes, I think an increasing awareness can be prompted in the education sector as well.
I have a question. To move in the frontier up, what do you think are the three main drivers that companies have to implement to move that frontier and have this efficient and cost at the same level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so as I said earlier, there's two main classes, right? Innovation broadly defined, which can be product innovation as well as technology and all of that. And then there's digitalization. I think both are difficult. It's a question of what's easiest for a specific company in a specific stage of development and environment. And I don't think there's a universal answer for that. I have a bias for digitalization because I'm an analyst, so I deal with data and with models, and I think that that is very much needed. And I think that that should be a cornerstone of any strategic decision making. But having said that, it might be actually easier to start with technological innovation. So working on designing a new product, it really depends on what stage you're in. Okay. Any further questions from our Zoom participants?
Just a comment to say from Virpi, which I hope I pronounced correctly, that the war in Ukraine being with us, resilience is more important than ever.
Yeah, I think that we can all support that argument.
Sorry, it's me again from South Africa. And this is, I'd like to hear your view on this. I think in the world, to a large extent, trust is broken. And part of the solution is if you trust your supply chain partners and you sort of both up and downstream. And I think their technology is important, especially communication. I mean, you've got data available. If you can actually start accurately sharing your supply chain data or some of your supply chain data with the whole supply chain, it will be far more seamless. And I think you can actually move out the frontier and get both efficiency and resilience at the same time. But I mean, we're not a trusting generation to start with.
Yeah, I think a little bit of that has to do with culture. There have been many studies that show how trust levels differ by culture and by historical, precedent. It's true. There's a huge area of research that looked at supply chain cooperation and information sharing and what are the mechanisms for reducing this. It's more needed now than ever, but that has been there for a while. And so I hope that the recent events and the current environment is going to catalyze that. Yeah, how do you deal with the trust issue? Not quite sure, because it goes way beyond the contracting aspects, way beyond involving lawyers and having all the safeguards in place. All right, so with that, I suggest that we may take a short break. You're welcome to stay here for the second iteration of this session, or else we'll start back again in 5 minutes.